Hey, welcome. People are filtering in. We'll give another couple of seconds as folks join. I'm Laura Foote from YIMBY Action. Welcome to our recurring series, Making Urbanism Anti-Racist, where we hear from folks who are doing all kinds of different things in the urbanism space, talking about racism, our history of laws that have gotten us to this point, the impact of the laws that we have right now, and how urbanism has really intersected with, wrestled with racism in our society. We started doing these conversations in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement recently and really took it on as a place to have ongoing conversations and bring people into YIMBY who either have sees that there's a lot of potential for growth in us or are excited about being part of the urbanism project and want to make it a deliberately anti-racist project as well. Today, we are going to have Ernest Brown, our board chair of YIMBY Action, who has recently moved to Atlanta. And we're just so happy for him in his next phase in life, but he's still going to be the YIMBY Action board chair, is interviewing Stephen Menendian, who has been involved in both sort of the YIMBY adjacent movement and the urbanism movement for a really long time. Stephen helped found one of the organizations that we sue the suburbs and has been active in the pro-housing movement for a while as a angry lawyer sometimes, it seems like. So I'm going to turn it over to Ernest to talk more about the conversation they're going to have tonight and the Othering and Belonging Institute, which has done just amazing research over the years that has informed a lot of pro-housing, urbanism, and anti-racist thinking. Ernest, thanks, and take it over.
Thanks, Laura. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. I had a great prep session with Stephen. And I think what you're going to hear today is kind of a bit of a step back from some of the tools of urbanism. So the zoning reforms, the bike lanes, things like that. And really trying to get kind of a big picture view of like, how do we think about race and class and how they intersect in American society? How do we think about notions of sort of opportunity where it is and where it isn't in our cities and how urbanism can kind of create access to that? And we'll maybe talk about a few of the specific topics where those kind of like those ideas really kind of butt heads in urbanism. And then we're going to try to save some time at the end for questions from the audience. But there's going to be a lot of meaty stuff here today. So to jump right into it, Stephen, do you mind just doing a brief intro, just like who you are, what you've done, how you got to where you are now, and then we'll jump into the meat of this conversation.
Sure. So thank you both for having me. It's a pleasure, and there's a million things folks could be doing at 5:30 on a Thursday. So it's wonderful to have you in this space and having this conversation with us. I'm the Director of Research and Assistant Director at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. We used to be known as the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. So if you've heard of that institution, it's the same institution we just renamed and rebranded 2 years ago. And I've been there since 2012. A little bit of background, I grew up in the Midwest in a racially and economically segregated school system and city, suburb, meaning it was almost all white, and moved here to work at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley, well, Haas Institute in 2012. My first kind of phase of work was mostly focused on education, educational equity, education policy, pre-2010. And then I think like a lot of people who get involved in education policy, they eventually migrate to housing. And so pretty much since 2012, I would say 60% of my duties are research or research projects, programmatic work. I have administrative responsibilities as well, grant reporting, grant funding. But most of my portfolio that I'm personally involved in is either directly or related to housing and housing equity. So we had a wonderful conversation, Ernest, earlier this week. Maybe it would have been better if we just recorded that and posted that instead of this, but we'll try and duplicate that the best we can.
I believe we can, lightning will strike twice for us. I'm going to go ahead and put your bio in the chat so folks can be kind of looking at some of the breadth of stuff you've done in your research as they think of questions for you.
Great.
But to kind of get us started off, one of the really exciting things you've done recently is you chaired a conference on the Kerner Commission, which was a famous commission back in the 1960s, kind of looking at the state of race relations in America and what was sort of wrong then. And then sort of one thing that kind of strikes me with what I understand of that work and sort of the what has and has not changed is sort of some of the ways in which sort of even on issues of race, class seems to have become even more important. There's a book, to make a quick book plug, Disintegrated by Eugene Robinson, that sort of looks at Black America as this sort of population of what was once trapped in one part of town, but I guess post the 60s movement, we're able to sort of have Black celebrities and have a Black president and have a large Black middle class that like is not as defined by its race because of some level of economic opportunity, whereas some problems that are in a Donald Trump's mind, the urban issues are really just the problems of poor African Americans, who are a sizable portion, disproportionately poor, but by no means all. And so I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk to us a little bit about how those notions of class and income are related to notions of race in the American context, and how that should just kind of structure how we think about those issues.
Yes. So this is the perennial race versus class question. And it's come up over and over again in different contexts. But before I tackle that question, let me just explain what the Kerner Commission was, because it was a remarkable initiative. So I don't think I've ever said this publicly, but if there are three kind of American documents or tracts that I think every citizen or aspiring American citizen should read to really understand the country, the first would be the Constitution and the Federalist Papers. Federalist Papers are a remarkable set of documents. And a lot of people know the main author of that, Alexander Hamilton, but they're really philosophical tracts about the history of the United States. The second would be the 9/11 Commission, because not because so much, well, it actually does provide a history of the Middle East and US interventions, but it also provides an incredible insight into the workings of the American government at different levels, all the way from firefighters and police to, the networks of military power and espionage and the CIA and so on. And the third would be the Kerner Commission. The Kerner Commission, I think, is probably the landmark document in the last century that documents racial inequality in the United States. There's one other, I think, document that contends for that from the 20th century, and that's probably Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, who was a famous sociologist, who's a Swedish sociologist who did an immense study on race and inequality during World War II. But what happened with the Kerner Commission is that in 1967, there were a series of police encounters with mostly young Black men in major urban areas. And those encounters, like most of the encounters that we are become so familiar with in the last decade, resulted in either shootings or the deaths of these young men. And invariably, these encounters resulted in major uprisings across those cities in the country. So there were, by the Kerner Commission's own account, at least 150 uprisings in over 100 cities over the course of 1967. And in particular, it was called the Long Hot Summer of 1967. And so President Johnson in 1967, who, by the way, had won election in a landslide, after he became president, after JFK was killed, and then he won election in 1964 in one of the most record-smashing landslides in American history. And then, 4 years later, decided he would not run again, even though he was eligible for re-election. So he appointed at the end of 1967 a commission, a bipartisan commission headed by Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois, and included mayors like Mayor Lindsay out of New York City, Republicans, Democrats, judges, congressional representatives, people from labor, people from business. It was a bipartisan commission, and it was set out to investigate three questions. What happened in 1967? Why did it happen? And what could be done to prevent it? And so the Special Blue Ribbon Commission produced a report, and the report, funnily enough, was published on Leap Day, 1968, so February 29th, 1968. And the report was a watershed. They had, teams of researchers who swept into cities, interviewing people, particularly Black youth, on the uprisings. They interviewed, police. They interviewed city leaders, and over again, the profiles. You could almost, the profiles are essentially what was profiled by the Department of Justice in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and presumably Chicago after, and Minneapolis after these recent events. The details differ, but the overarching series of events is basically identical, right? Police and you have background conditions of racial inequality. You have disparities in terms of access to employment, disparities in income and home ownership and rents and housing conditions. And then you have what they call, basically background conditions in a precipitating event. And the precipitating event was almost always an encounter with police, and usually police and violence. But there were also background conditions of police harassment and police abuse, which is part of the story today. It's not just as if these uprisings in Baltimore and Ferguson happen out of nothing, right? It's the background conditions that create the powder keg, and then the encounter is the trigger for these uprisings, these urban rebellions. And they happened in the Bay Area, in Bayview Hunters Point uprising 2 years before. It might have been 1 year before, I think 66. And so the report was 500 pages. It documented profiles of the cities. It described social science profiles of the economic conditions. And then it had essentially a historical retrospective on race in America. And then it turned to figure out what to do, and had over 100 recommendations for education, for housing, for transportation and infrastructure and healthcare. And almost none of those recommendations were adopted. One of the recommendations, even to this day, one of the recommendations in the report was for a federal open housing law, which is an anachronistic term today, but open housing is essentially prohibiting discrimination in sale, lease, or rental of housing, and actually went nowhere. Johnson's political capital had been sapped through the Vietnam War. He was almost a lame duck by the time the Kerner report came around. The Blue Ribbon Commission, again, landed in almost no inertia. But 2 months later, the Fair Housing Act was federal law. And the reason was because Martin Luther King was shot and killed on April 4th. And I think it was by April 11th, the Fair Housing Act was law. It was the last major accomplishment of the civil rights era. So there were a handful of things that actually have occurred in the Kerner report, but 95% of it is still on the shelf, waiting to be implemented. It was kind of like an agenda for addressing structural racism. And a lot of it had to do with building new housing. I think it said something like 2 million new housing units and 2 million new apartment units should be built over like 3 or 4 years. So for a total of 4, which we haven't done. Anyway, so there are obviously new things that have happened. Mass incarceration is really a post 1970 event, and there are subprime crisis, other things that have occurred. But the Kerner Commission was a landmark report. So to understand racial inequality in America, I think the Kerner, you don't have to look further than the Kerner Commission. Now, there are a lot of things that have happened since, but it still stands the test of time, even though it's 52 years old at this point. Now, to answer your question, what's the relationship between race and class? Is it race? Is it class? Aren't racial inequalities really reducible to class? Is one way of paraphrasing the question, right? Well, the way that I like to answer the question is that if race matters, then clearly race has an independent effect, right, that can't be explained by class. And if class can explain all racial inequality, then you don't need an independent race lens. And I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that race does independently matter. And I can give you a couple of examples. So one example is that there are certain forms of poverty that are highly racialized. So for example, I'll give you 3. One is concentrated poverty. In the social science literature, concentrated poverty is a very, very important concept. And it's the concept that 40% or more of people in a neighborhood earn below the poverty line. And the reason concentrated poverty is a socially scientific and significant concept is because over a certain critical mass of people in poverty, a bunch of social ills begin to metastasize. Once you have a certain number of people in poverty, because poverty doesn't actually matter, despite what we think at the individual level, it actually matters at the structural level, at the neighborhood level. So I'll give you an example. If you are a child who's growing up in a family that earns below the poverty line, in a neighborhood of mostly affluent or middle-class people, your school, your neighborhood, your environment is actually likely to be quite healthy, likely to have low crime rates, unlikely to have exposure to environmental toxins. You're likely to have plenty of green space for exercise. You're likely to have access to fresh food and produce. You're likely to have access to jobs and so on. But if you are a poor person living in a poor neighborhood, the opposite of all those things. And in fact, that's why it's better to be a poor person in a middle income neighborhood than a middle income person in a poor neighborhood. Because if you're a middle income person or even a high income person living in a poor neighborhood of concentrated poverty, all of those structural things are likely to be negative for you. The school is likely to be underperforming. The neighborhood is likely to have higher rates of crime. The environmental toxins, you probably have more particulate matter. You're likely to have lead in the water. The infrastructure is likely to be less, there are all sorts of problems that are going to accrue. So concentrated poverty, just as a general fact, basically doesn't exist for white people. There are almost no white people in the United States, even poor white people who live in neighborhoods that are, again, 40% or more people living under the poverty line. Just a phantom phenomenon. You can't find white neighborhoods. There may be a few places in Appalachia that are concentrated poverty, but it just doesn't exist. Even in the poorest parts of the South, there is almost nowhere that has, where they're predominantly white, that is 40% or more people in poverty. And yet it's actually quite intense for predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods or Hispanic neighborhoods. There are plenty of high poverty neighborhoods. So that's the first form of poverty that's racialized. And if you were just to use a class lens and just look for people in poverty, you would actually miss that, because a plurality of people in poverty are white, but there's no neighborhoods of concentrated poverty that are white, right? And so a pure class lens obscures, masks, invisibilizes these particular expressions of poverty that are racialized. Second example is durable poverty. Durable poverty is especially harmful because people who are in poverty for 10 or more years have all sorts of negative harms and ills that come from that. So for example, there are lots of white people who are in poverty because, for example, they're graduate students and they're earning low or negative income, or they're starting a business, right? And they have low or negative income in the short term. But if you have poverty, if you're in poverty for 10 or more years, it means that you're probably disaffected from labor markets, your social capital is limited, your human capital and skills are limited. You probably do not have access to consistent healthcare. You probably don't have access to, consistently healthy environments. So your exposure to all these negative effects is probably much greater. And it turns out that durable poverty, again, even though at certain points in time there are more white people in poverty in aggregate than people of color, durable poverty almost doesn't exist for white people. White people experience poverty intermittently or in period timeframes of less than 10 years. But durable poverty is very pronounced. I think it's something like 11% for people, for African Americans. And the third form of poverty, perhaps the most harmful of all, is childhood poverty. You can look at just aggregate numbers of people in poverty, right? And you'll see, that basically Black poverty is double white poverty. But if you look at childhood poverty, it's something like 40% of Black children live in families that earn below the federal poverty line. That number is, I think, in the single digits for white children. So the disparities are much greater when you look at those particular forms of poverty. And again, if you were just to say, is this about class and not race, then you would miss the intersection, right? That how these particular expressions of poverty are racialized. So let me just step back for a moment. The other part of answering the question is that race and class in the United States, this is an academic term, but they're co-constitutive, meaning that you can't actually disentangle them. I'll give you an example. So in the United States, race is very salient, right? But we don't actually have a class consciousness in the United States that's very developed. Certainly nothing like, say, England or Britain, where your class position, right? Middle class, working class, aristocracy, and everything in between. You can tell just from someone's speech exactly where they are in the class pecking order, whether they go to a public school. In England, it's public schools or private schools. And the same is true for France and other Western countries that have very much more of a class consciousness. The United States has never developed really a class consciousness. Just to think about this, most people in the United States, whether they're poor or very wealthy, still think of themselves as middle class, right? And so class is really a kind of fleeting, ephemeral concept in the United States, unless you're talking to an economist who studies class dynamics, then they can probably give you a very specific definition. But that definition eludes or elides the social construction of class, right? Because an economist definition of upper class, if you were to survey those people, many of those people who are, according to the economist definition of upper class, would consider themselves middle class, probably because they came from middle class backgrounds in many cases, right? And they view their kind of ethic and their way of being in the world as middle class. So we don't have, certainly not like Europe, a class consciousness to organize around, but race certainly, right? I mean, we're highly attuned to race. And so there are certain constructions or concepts of class, my last point, that are racialized. So think about the kind of unending election analysis, especially after Trump's victory. And the debate was sort of like, how do we get back the working class? And actually that working class concept of the working class vote was actually coded white. Or I'll give you another example, give you two more examples. Reagan Democrats. Reagan Democrats, many of you are probably not old enough to remember this concept, but they were basically post-New Deal, like union labor workers who voted for Reagan. That was coded white, right? Or the middle class, right? Because the post-war housing policy was exclusionary, suburbs were coded white. If you were to say urban person or suburban person, that's coded racially, right? It's geography, but it's coded racially. Now, of course, it's not true. You can look at the data and see that majority of people of color live in the suburbs, but it's still coded, right, by race. And so class and geography are inflected with racial meanings. And to just reduce something to class actually misses the racial dimensions. The point I'm making is a really simple one. You cannot reduce class to race in the United States or vice versa. They both have independent explanatory power. And an attempt to reduce it will wash out dynamics that help explain outcomes and causes. Hopefully that wasn't too academic.
I think it was accessible to me. And I think that's just so foundational to really make sure that as we understand why it's necessary to do those crosstabs that way, right? To release to see the world in its full complexity and not miss out on that by lacking either the race, the class lens, and how we think about this. One of the things you said that really hit me, and I think a stat I've heard, there's that middle and even sort of approaching kind of upper class Black families are more likely to live in sort of a kind of high poverty neighborhood than sort of poor white people. I think that kind of gets to the point you were making earlier around just sort of the existence of sort of concentrated poverty in a way amongst African American communities that it simply doesn't exist in white communities. And from an urbanist standpoint, kind of where my mind kind of goes to, it's this notion of opportunity. It was sort of built into some of the SB 50 debates we were having in California over the past few years. The Moving to Opportunity program is sort of something I know people trying with sort of what to do about the public housing question. And so to put in a somewhat specific question, and I'm going to drop a few resources in the chat so folks can kind of see what this looks like visually based on some of the mapping work Othering Belonging Institute has done. But can you just help us think about and help the audience understand these two kind of major strategies of how do we try to improve the life outcomes, particularly for poor children? So on one hand, the moving to opportunity, let's take them out of where they are and put them in the suburbs or wherever the good amenities are, versus the kind of place building approach where we say, okay, we've got a downtown area, we've got a neglected former industrial area. How do we revitalize it? How do we bring the resources? How do we do something in that space, but also try to make sure the existing residents benefit from it? Can you just talk to us about what we know from the research about the success of either of those tools and sort of how they've played out recently?
Yes. So if you think the race versus class debate is intense, try wading into the mobility versus place-based debate, right? I mean, that's been waged on different fronts for almost 50 years now. The Kerner Commission actually got it right. They said, it framed the question, what do we do? Do we do mobility strategy or investment in place? And the Kerner Commission basically said we have to do both. And I think that's basically right. But I think there's another way of cutting through that debate. And to explain that, let me first describe some of the mobility interventions, and then secondly, explain what I mean by the concept of opportunity. So the first mobility strategy that was really attempted in the United States on the race basis that really mattered was the Gatro Settlement. So Dorothy Gatro was a public housing resident who lived in the metropolitan region, the city of Chicago. And she sued the Chicago Housing Authority in the late 1960s, arguing that the housing policy administered by the authority concentrated low-income public housing residents in highly segregated neighborhoods. And the federal court that heard this case sided with Dorothy. There's a funny book by Alexander Pavlikov called "Waiting for Gatro" about the settlement and what a landmark it was. I should say the title's funny, not necessarily the content. But so the federal court said the Chicago Housing Authority, for the first time, had to implement a metropolitan-wide desegregation plan for public housing residents, meaning that it couldn't just put public housing within the city limits of Chicago, but had to extend to the surrounding suburbs, because otherwise it couldn't really meaningfully desegregate public housing residents. And this went to the Supreme Court, and this was in the time when the Supreme Court was transitioning to a more conservative bench with a bunch of Nixon appointees. And the court sided with Dorothy Gatro. And so this was the first basically major intervention in what we call mobility strategies, where you take low-income people, often people of color, and you facilitate and subsidize their move to a higher opportunity environment, right? Often more integrated. And it was very successful. Now, it wasn't a controlled experiment, but in general, the longitudinal surveys and study work on this intervention showed that children who grow up as a part of this intervention had much better life outcomes. And so it inspired an experiment in the 1990s called Moving to Opportunity, which was funded during the Clinton administration through HUD and by Congress. And Moving to Opportunity was an experiment held in 5 cities, including Baltimore, I think Philadelphia. I think it was Philadelphia, I'm not sure if it was Baltimore, but you can just look up MTO and you can find it. And it wasn't race-based like Gatro, because Gatro was a federal judge, right, figuring out the remedy. For MTO, they decided it was really simple. They were going to divide all of the public housing residents, or voucher holders in this case, into 3 groups. They were going to have a control group where people just stayed wherever they were. They were going to have a second group where they allowed people to give them a voucher of a certain value, and they could go wherever they wanted or wherever they could find. And then there was the experimental group, which is a group who was given vouchers, but they had to move into a neighborhood that had poverty rates of less than 10%, right? So it was a class-based intervention, and that the maximum poverty rate was 10%, but I think they basically gave an additional subsidy. And they had very limited supports for it. So they typically now in mobility strategies, they say, we need to give you counseling, we need to give you, all sorts of interventions, drive you around and have you look around and see the neighborhoods and advance. In this case, the experiment was undertaken in these 5 cities, and then the money ran out, and then they studied the researchers studied the effects. And the initial results were somewhat disappointing. The girls who moved as part of this experiment had slightly better outcomes. The boys, basically, it didn't look like they had better outcomes. Girls did better on, I think it was math and language proficiency. Boys actually may have had slightly worse outcomes. And the adults who moved appeared to have basically no increased levels of employment or labor force participation, at least not visibly. Although the one very positive outcome from MTO was that people's mental health improved, that the stress environment, there was reduction in crime and violence, and the stress of living in a high poverty neighborhood significantly diminished. But one of the critics at the time of the construction of the MTO program said that it was flawed in fundamental ways. So one criticism of the MTO program was that it wasn't race conscious, right? You just set this arbitrary number of neighborhood poverty, which is far below concentrated poverty, right? 10% is far below 40%. And secondly, that it didn't force people to move far enough. In many cases, people were moving to adjacent neighborhoods that were maybe on the dimension of poverty better off, but declining, right? Declining inner ring suburbs where the schools were in decline. And part of it was it didn't extricate people out of their social networks and build social capital. They would, for example, move, a couple blocks away, still go to the same church, go to the same bowling alley, still, participate in the same team sports. And so the social networks were roughly the same, even if the neighborhood was slightly better. And so critics say, well, based upon these flaws, you're not going to expect the kind of outcomes that you saw in Gatro, which were much more dramatic. Fast forward 20 years, Raj Chetty and his team of economists got de-identified tax records from the IRS and actually looked at the children who moved in the MTO experiment, and they found dramatic improvements. Off the top of my head, it was something like $3,000 to $4,000 more per income per year for children who moved younger than the age of 12 as part of MTO. And it wasn't just correlation, they were actually able to establish causality because you could control for sibling pairs. So for example, if you had a family who moved as part of MTO and one kid was 5 and the other kid was 11, you could actually compare and see how those two kids did. The exposure effect of living in the kind of opportunity neighborhood. So even despite all the flaws of MTO, it still had tremendously positive effects years later. And Ernest is putting all the studies and stuff into the chat so people can look into this. And there have been a number of other quote unquote natural experiments and other mobility experiments since then. There's the Denver child study. There is a study of people who were displaced because of Katrina. Many of these are funded by HUD. And so it also inspired what was called the Small Area Fair Market Rent Program, which was an initiative during the Obama administration, where voucher holders who hold Section 8 vouchers could actually, part of the barriers to getting into high opportunity neighborhoods is they're just much more expensive. And if you get a voucher, first of all, only about a third of people who qualify for vouchers get one. The waiting list can be 5 to 8 years. I think sometimes they even close the waiting list because there's so many people need vouchers. But part of the barrier is that the subsidy is key to the metropolitan region. And as all urbanists know, there is a lot of variation in housing costs and rents depending on which neighborhood you are within a region, right? And so essentially the subsidy just cuts off access to 30, 20% of all neighborhoods in any region. So the small area fair market rent concept was to increase the subsidy, not at the metropolitan level, but at the zip code level, so that you could get up to 120% subsidy of the median rent in the zip code. And that was a wonderful intervention that was, I believe, shut down during the Trump administration, should be revived. And it was an experiment that should be expanded. So I guess the point I'm trying to make, so I've just kind of given you an overview of the mobility strategies. The flip side is the place-based strategies. Place-based strategies are basically this. It's where you pour investments into a particular neighborhood. They could be neighborhood revitalization. There were a lot of them in the 80s and 90s, Hope 6, business credits, all sorts of subsidies. Unfortunately, the record of place-based strategies is very poor. And the few that have some indicia of success, like the Harlem Children's Zone. So the Harlem Children's Zone concept is just, let's flood the zone with resources. It's anchored by a charter school, but it has a set of wraparound services. It has education and training supports for adults. It has food and laundry services for children. It has, language learning supports, all sorts of supports. The results of the Harlem Children's Zone is that, yes, it improves life for the children in the zone, but basically no difference for adults. And certainly no difference for children who aren't in the charter school. The problem, I think the problem with place-based strategies, and the reason they don't work, is because there's no amount of investment, whether it's municipal investment, state investment, federal subsidies, that can actually overcome the undertow quality that these places of concentrated poverty or low opportunity have. And the reason, I'll get to the second part of the question now, is how do I define opportunity? What is opportunity? I define opportunity as the pathways available and accessible to people in their life course. And generally speaking, if people have more access to opportunity, they're going to have better life outcomes, as measured by any measure of well-being. The typical and most prevailing measure of opportunity or outcome is just economic mobility, usually through intergenerational transition matrices, which is a complex word for or term to describe, if you're born in the bottom income quintile, what's your chance of becoming middle class or even making it to the top income quintile? And so you can actually measure outcomes based upon, de-identified tax records, and the Opportunity Atlas that Raj Chetty and his team has co-created and is available. You can actually see that, and you can look and see it's disaggregated by race as well. So you can see, for example, for any census tract in the country, if people are born into poverty, what percentage of those children make it to the top? Now, nationwide, the figure is, I don't know, Ernest, what people would predict. Maybe we could pull, like, what percentage of children born in the bottom income quintile would you think make it to the top? If opportunity and social and economic mobility were perfectly equal, if we had really equal opportunity in the United States, the figure should be 20%, right? 20% of children, it's tautological, 20% of children born in the bottom income quintile should make it at the top, and 20% of children born to the top income quintile should fall to the bottom. Maybe we can ask people to just poll and guess what the answer would be. And I'll give the answer in a minute. But it turns out that it's highly racialized. So the question is for the poll is, what percentage of children born in the bottom income quintile nationally make it to the top? I'll let someone figure out the poll, and I'll give you the answer.
Zoom is not kind. You have to plan in advance to have a poll.
Yeah, my bad.
You can just put it in
threw
the chat.
Threw you for a loop on this one. But it turns out it's highly racialized, right? That African American children, African American children, about 50% of African American children born in the bottom income quintile stay there as adults. And it's actually about 20% for whites. Overall, the figure of mobility from the bottom income quintile to the top is 7.5% in the United States. But when you disaggregate by race, it's very different. You know, it's under 3% for African Americans, and it's like 18% for whites. So upward mobility in the United States, and this part of it has to do with concentrated poverty, this undertow quality, is very much racialized. So the answer, the reason that opportunity is racialized is because of structural racism. Because all these resources that concatenate, right? The city you live in, the quality of the school district you attend, the amenities in your neighborhood, access to employment, they're all distributed on a racial basis, not just a class basis. Because upper income African Americans live in disproportionately lower opportunity neighborhoods, and poor whites live in disproportionately middle income neighborhoods or even higher opportunity neighborhoods. So it's very odd, very strange dynamics there. And to bring it back to the first part of the question, to wrap up here, the reason place-based interventions don't work is because the opportunity structure is so complex that you can't actually put enough resources into it to rebuild it from scratch. There was actually an effort to do that, to build a city out of scratch during the New Deal. FDR and his wife conceived of this idea of building a city in West Virginia out of scratch. They would build all the homes, they would build industry, they would build the factories, they would build the neighborhoods, they'd build the schools, everything. And it was this idea that, you know, we can use government to create investments that are so robust that they'll actually create opportunity. It failed because government can't create all of the opportunity structures. What it can do is it can fabricate pieces of the opportunity structure. It can create investments in infrastructure and human capital that allow people to flourish, but it can't create everything out of whole cloth. So that was a long-winded answer, but the answer to the question of mobility versus place is that almost no place-based strategies have succeeded, and almost every mobility strategy has succeeded or has evidence of success, especially on a long-term basis. And the reason for that is because mobility strategies are sensitive to opportunity. So here's how you break the mobility versus place debate. Move people to opportunity wherever opportunity is. If opportunity is growing in place, keep people in that place. If opportunity doesn't exist where you are, then move people to where it is. So you don't have to move people. If opportunity is growing where you are, just keep them in place. But if it doesn't exist there, then you need to get them to where opportunity is. That's the way you cut through that debate.
So first off, just want to remind our attendees, we have a Q&A. We will be looking to it in a few minutes to pull some questions out from the audience. And I've been dropping helpful links about Stephen, about stuff he's been talking about in case that piques your interest or questions. But one of my last questions, just want to actually kind of go down that same vein you were going down, Stephen. The shifting geography of opportunity, particularly this concept of sort of, city centers, urban core, seeing a reappreciation in the minds of college educated young people and maybe even old people, and this taste for sort of city living again, and sort of how that is sort of let's just call it to be wildly simplistic, so forgive me, gentrification, just this notion of certain cities that may have 20 years ago been a place that doesn't have opportunity, you have to move out of there. But what do we know, or can we know yet? Is it too early about what that return to the city has meant for the presence and access to opportunity in those neighborhoods? And again, the point you were making about as that shift occurs, are long-term residents, and particularly children, able to stay and benefit from any increase in opportunity? Or does, as soon as the opportunity arrives, their ability to stay goes right out the door, and it doesn't really, in a meaningful way, make them better off?
It's a great question. I want to answer the question by zooming out. But before I do that, I want to just go back to my definition of opportunity. I said opportunity is the full set of pathways available to people to which they have access, right? If you live next to a university or a hospital, but you don't have health insurance and you don't have any services provided to you from that university, it doesn't matter that you live next to it. You need to have access. It's like a library, right? If you don't have the library card, you can't get access to the institution. It doesn't benefit you. So proximity is often a proxy for access, but it doesn't always mean access. So I just wanted to flag that. So zooming out for a second, the post-war period in American society is really anomalous in a lot of ways, right? If you read Thomas Piketty's book, he talks about how the collapse of capital in the post-war period, right? We had massive investments in the middle class. It's very hard to figure out, absent disasters on the scale of, I don't know, World War II, how you get back to that kind of equality in capital. But one of the ways it was anomalous is in the distribution of how people lived, right? Basically for centuries, if not millennia, but certainly centuries, certainly going back to, I would say, you know, the 16th or 17th century, people lived, the affluent lived in the urban core, right? So Paris, London, you know, the most affluent people lived in the downtown, closest to the downtown area. And so in social scientific terms, you would just say miles or kilometers from CBD, and you would see an income distribution that goes, you know, up to down, you know, a really strong and obvious curve. The post-war America was an anomaly in that regard, right? Because what happened was we subsidized through FHA and the GI Bill and highway construction, the suburbs. We basically paid people through government policy to move to the suburbs, and we built the suburbs. I mean, indirectly, right? Ira Katz-Nelson wrote a book about this, and others have as well. When affirmative action was white. So the point is that some people call this the Great Inversion, right? Where people are returning back to the cities and they want to live urban life, you know, and so on. I would say that ideal of the far-flung suburb is an extreme anomaly in world history. That most people, you know, you have a gradient of the most affluent living closest to the city center and the poorest living in the furthest fringe, in the most exurban or rural areas. You know, I guess if you go to the Middle Ages, it might be different because you have a manorial system. But for most of urban, you know, Western life, it's been that gradient. And so the question is, how do we manage that? Because there's a very possible dystopian outcome here, which is where we return to that kind of incredible class difference, where the poorest people in America are shunted to the periphery of our most vibrant regions, or even worse, to our states, you know, that have the weakest opportunity. And so people talk about, like, not just going from California to Texas, which is to some extent overstated during the pandemic, but moving to the outskirts of cities around Texas, where you have the weakest schools, the weakest infrastructure, but the cost of living is so much more affordable. And so I think, yes, the trick is to try and figure out how to keep people in place and prevent them from being displaced. And there are different strategies for doing that. One is, you know, and in some circles it's anathema, but rent control and rent stabilization can be very effective at preventing displacement in the short term until you can build enough housing, keep, you know, affordable housing to keep, or enough housing to bring the housing costs down to keep people in place and allow them to move. Now, I prefer narrowly tailored rent control policies. So I'm not whole hog on rent control policies. Narrowly tailored would be, for example, those that have sunset provisions that are time capped, or those that target particular neighborhoods or census tracts based on conditions in those neighborhoods, rather than just covering the whole city. But I think those can be very effective anti-displacement measures. So yes, if opportunity is growing, if resources are concatenating, if there are more investments being made in those places, we should prevent people from being displaced in those places. That's both just a moral imperative as well as a racial justice goal.
Thank you. All right, so we are getting a couple questions from the audience. I may save one for myself as we get to close, but want to get a couple of audience questions in here. So one attendee asked, so in the MTO framework, how do you preserve Black institutions, businesses, and history while moving people out of, so assuming you do the MTO, right, out of areas with longstanding Black institutions, businesses, and history, and into areas with great opportunity? Or is that simply the opportunity cost of pursuing that strategy? So if we went whole hog for moving to opportunity, how do we think about that trade-off?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So one of the criticisms of desegregation in the Jim Crow South was that basically it allowed middle income or upper income African Americans to move into predominantly white neighborhoods and leave behind basically neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, right? And so the criticism there is that you know, and there are sometimes these kind of narratives of living in the Jim Crow South. While people know it was designed to be oppressive, there are sometimes people who say, well, you know, I had the doctor, the barber, the the shoe salesman, the insurance, everything on the same neighborhood. And we had teachers who were invested in our well-being. The way I answer the question is you always have to look at outcomes and data. So Rucker Johnson has studied desegregation on a longitudinal basis. He has massive data sets to look at test scores. And he found that Black children who were desegregated through federal court mandates and went to integrated schools performed much better, not just in school, but over their life course than children who remained assigned in segregated schools, with no corresponding reduction in the performance of white students. This is probably the most remarkable part of it. So desegregation, and yes, did those children, like, look at the experience of Little Rock 9. You can find the photographs online of those kids being spit upon. It happened not just in the South, it happened in Boston, it happened in Chicago, it happened in Columbus. Wherever integration happened, you had not just microaggressions, you had hostility and violence. I mean, Boston, South Boston, white parents were throwing rocks. Kids were, parents and adults were sent to the hospital in the 70s. It was often bloody, but the outcomes in the data are unequivocal. Now, data can't tell you everything. It can't tell you, the emotional and psychological well-being of these children and now adults. But the data does strongly suggest that these children were much better off. So are children better off going to low-performing schools where teachers are more likely to be emotionally invested in mentors in the children, or are they better off going to high-performing schools where they'll have higher incomes as adults, more likely to own a home, less likely to be incarcerated, their children will benefit through intergenerational income transfers and so on. I can't weigh those trade-offs. That's for people, those for policymakers and for other people to decide. But I think in general, the outcomes are what are key. Now, if businesses were created because of segregation, that's an artificial byproduct, right? That's never going to be sustainable in the first place. It's a little bit like racial gerrymandering, right? You have basically, think about the difference between a legislator who represents a quote unquote majority minority district, or someone like Barack Obama, right, who has to appeal to everyone, right? And there's a different set of strategies there. There's been interesting political science research on these questions. And there are people who follow Barack Obama, like the senator from New Jersey, Cory Booker, and others who, have broad, Kamala Harris, another example. So it's unclear, but I would say there are certainly costs to desegregation, but the evidence on the whole seems to suggest that outcomes are better through it.
Thank you. So a lot of questions coming in on the MTO versus no place-based debate. Another one of them is sort of I guess, and to kind of bring it to the present. The question literally says, did any of the place-based interventions test basic minimum income or direct cash to families rather than social interventions? And so I might say, yeah. do the programs like the UBIs, the Stockton experiment, I think that's being expanded. Yeah. Are any of those a possible way of sort of getting some of the benefits of place-based while still achieving some of the impacts of moving to opportunity to direct improvement? Those are much more short-term, so we can't speak to the long-term, I understand, but got some questions along that line.
So to qualify for MTO voucher, you had to earn below a certain income level. So they were income restricted. Gatro was the same thing because it was public housing residents. But you could establish, I mean, just look, voucher holders, like food stamps, SNAP, they're income restricted. They're not universal programs, which UBI is by definition universal. That's another debate, by the way, targeting versus universal. We won't get into that one. That's another rabbit hole. But UBI, it's unclear. I mean, those are very small scale. One of the criticisms of mobility strategy is that to fully fund mobility strategy, you might have to fund 6 million Americans to be able to move, which is probably infeasible. So there's a cost associated with that that's very expensive, which is why place-based interventions still matter. And the Kerner Commission grappled with that. Am I missing any part of the question, or did I catch?
No, that was that question. Trying to see. Here's a really interesting question that I think you should be able to see it in your chat as well. Just the question kind of speaking to we've spoken a lot of kind of black and white, which is now true in the American South, back where I am, but in California, the racial makeup is much more complex than that. So speaking to the history of Chinese Americans and the California, Latino Americans, just any way that sort of more colorful picture changes what we're talking about, or is it a very similar story across those groups?
It's actually gradients between them. So you can look at any measure of well-being. You could look at home ownership. You could look at unemployment. You could look at labor force participation. You could look at life expectancy. You could look at infant mortality. You could look at rates of incarceration, right? You could look at college matriculation or high school graduation rates or national merit scholars. Basically, Hispanic, Latinx performance falls somewhere between, usually closer to the African American experience, depending. There are a lot of complications here. So let's just acknowledge, that these racial group experiences have different history, right? I mean, Chinese exclusion, Japanese internment, the Immigration Acts of 1965 create very different experiences. And also these groups are heterogeneous, right? I mean, Asian covers a multitude of groups. The Vietnamese had a very particular experience. So does Latinx, right? Cuban experience. We saw Florida during the last election, very different Cuban American experience, especially those who lived in Miami, fled during the Cuban Revolution. Very different experience than, say, those who are descendants of Mexican parents or Mexican grandparents, right? Or even other national experiences, right? Honduras, El Salvador, so on, Colombia. So you can't reduce to a single experience, but by and large, the distribution of opportunity remains racialized across those groups. Now, in some cases and on some of those dimensions, Asian Americans outperform whites. So in terms of like SAT performance, there's actually Asians slightly outperform whites. On certain things, Latinos actually underperform African Americans. So if you look I'll give you an example. If you look at uninsured rates of uninsurance with respect to healthcare in California, by far the group that's furthest, has the largest disparity between whites is Hispanics. And in fact, African Americans have about the same rate of uninsurance as Asians in California. So, it just depends on the measure. But you can basically, there's a gradient that runs from white to black, with other groups falling in between, or in some cases on the other end of that gradient or that continuum.
The last couple of questions are going to try to get into the solutioning space and understand as a research, so some of that is now maybe beyond what you can speak to. But one of them sort of, if development trends don't support affordable housing, just given the cost of build and the amount, how do we support cost-burden families who are waiting for the market to close the gap between the need for housing and more inventory in urban areas? So just like, how should we, I mean, some of that is just the very premise of the YIMBY movement, but just curious with your research of what you've seen, how do you speak to that?
Well, part of the problem is that there's never going to be a silver bullet for any of these problems, right? So if we talk about the housing crisis, but there's actually like 5 housing crises, right? There's the affordable housing crisis, there's the lack of production crisis, there's the gentrification displacement crisis, there is the persistence of segregation crisis, right? There's different crises. And we talk past each other because we're often not talking about the same thing or having clarity around the same thing. what I argue in our research is that you cannot achieve any of these, you can't address any of these crises or achieve any of these goals without reforming zoning, first and foremost. But reforming zoning is not actually going to solve any of these problems by itself. Because, for example, zoning is only one tool in a suite of land use regulation. Houston doesn't have zoning, and yet it basically has a panoply of land use regulations that function identically, right? You have discretionary reviews, you have, parking minimums, those are examples, floor area ratios, you have all these sorts of land use controls, including environmental controls that can produce the same thing. Now, zoning is the most prominent and salient aspect of that. So your question is, how do we, we need multiple strategies simultaneously, and we suggested 5 strategies that we think will work. The first is you need to reform zoning, but you also need rent stabilization and rent control to prevent displacement in the short term. And the types of neighborhoods where, see, the trick with rent control is you don't want to rent control, frankly, newcomers who are higher income, because that's not who you're trying to protect. You're trying to protect pre-existing residents. So you want to tailor it, like through rent stabilization or similar policies. So you want to target neighborhoods that are changing, or you want to target long integrated neighborhoods to prevent them from rapid change through new development. It doesn't mean you want to just stop development, quite the opposite. You just don't want the development to become a trigger for displacement. There are other things, there are all sorts of policy levers. There's housing trust funds. There are inclusionary zoning ordinances, all those have downsides. There's fair share strategies like RHNA. RHNA is, the funny part about RHNA is that RHNA is the gold standard for fair share in aspiration. It's just implementation is lacking, right? I mean, so fair share comes out of New Jersey, and Massachusetts has a version of it, Pennsylvania has a version of it, Connecticut has a version of it, but those versions are modest compared to RHNA, which segments income into 5 groups, right? And then requires municipalities to zone for all 5 groups. That's actually a brilliant segmentation. The problem is that it doesn't have teeth, and now SB 828 gave it a little bit more teeth, and now we're trying to give it more teeth. It just needs more strength. So the question is, what strategies do we use? Whatever it takes, right? Whatever we need, whatever we can use to keep people from being displaced in the course of more development is what we need to do. I think that rent control, rent stabilization are perfectly reasonable in the short term, right? To give time for new developments to bring down, either create more affordable housing through fair share plans or inclusionary zoning, or, and other, look, there are funding streams, right? So a number of municipalities across the Bay have taxed themselves to providing funding streams for, have through ballot initiatives, have created funding streams for affordable housing. And MTC is going to create a finance housing agency to help facilitate that development. It takes time. So you need to buy people time for these developments to come to fruition.
No, I think I'm obligated in my position as board chair to kind of plug, if you agree with what Stephen said about the RHNA and as an opportunity to sort of really get this right. YIMBY Action is one of our big focuses in California this year is the housing element process. So a lot of cities in the Bay Area, I believe, this year, and LA was kind of in it last year, are in the process of deciding, one, how much housing do they need to plan for, and then B, specifically where are they going to zone to allow that kind of housing. And there's an opportunity for public input to ensure that both know that the cities are, that regions are doing it in a way that is equitable between cities, and that the individual cities make realistic plans, because there's a bit of sort of, I'm trying to find an appropriate word for this, given this is being recorded. But cities aren't always judicious with finding appropriate sites to build the housing that they're supposed to at least plan for from a state level standpoint. And that's been a strong avenue for litigation, frankly, by the YIMBY movement. So definitely want to, there we go, got it in the chat, fairhousingelements.org, if you want to help out with that process. We are at the top of the hour, or the half hour, since we started the half hour. So do want to give you a moment to make any last comments you want to make, Stephen. And folks who enjoyed this, and whether it be housing elements or other parts of this fight, really what I recommend you go to yimbyaction.org/join. We'll put that in the chat as well, where you can continue to work with us as we try to understand these issues, but then take these into action and make sure that we press our policymakers to understand this history and apply at least some of these strategies as they are able. But any last words, Stephen?
Well, just that to go to the Othering and Belonging Institute website and check out some of our housing research. We've got, you know, a plethora of papers on housing. We have a paper called Unfair Shares that assesses RENA. We have a paper on LIHTC. We have papers on racial segregation. Part 5 of our series on racial residential segregation will have a lot of a description of the remedies, as well as a description of the summary of our research and other research. But you know, we have a long way to go, and there's a lot to do, because cities can't tackle this just all by themselves or in a piecemeal fashion. These problems have to be really addressed at the state or federal, even federal level. That's why I think like programs like the small area fair market rent program that can create more subsidies for vouchers, boosting the subsidy of vouchers, creating more vouchers. And there are other things besides, right? That we just need overall more investment in housing at every level of government, and hopefully we'll get there. But that includes subsidies for market rate development, that includes affordable housing. It's an all of the above.
Well, that's what we're all about here. So really appreciate the conversation, Stephen. And to all of our attendees, please look out for the next Making Urbanism Antiracist event. We'll be continuing the series. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.